And to examine that military, that is, that American and NATO military assistance that Jane was discussing with the soldier outside of Kyiv, we turn now to Nick Schifrin, who has returned to the U.S. after spending weeks in Ukraine.
Judy, NATO and the U.S. have provided Ukraine with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons just in the last few weeks. As you just heard, Ukrainian soldiers credit the aid in helping them resist a much larger Russian army. How have they done that? And will the additional assistance President Biden announced yesterday change things on the ground? To discuss that, we turn again to retired Lieutenant General Doug Lute, who had a 35-year career in the Army, served on the National Security Council staff in the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, and was President Obama's ambassador to NATO. Doug Lute, welcome back to the program. President Biden's announcement yesterday was the largest single military infusion to Ukraine since the war began. For the first time, it includes these kamikaze drones that have a 6-mile range and can explode on impact. And it includes 1,000 anti-tank javelins that you can see here. Ukrainian soldiers have used so effectively right there to pick off Russian tanks that have bunched up on roads. What's the impact of this new package?
Well, Nick, first of all, the $800 million, which was just approved, of course, totals out over the last year, brings that total to $2 billion worth of U.S. military assistance. And of course, that $2 billion U.S. is on top of the contributions of some 30 countries total. So just by way of quantity, yesterday's announcement was an important step, but very much continues in the pattern of the last year. The quality difference, though, is significant. So first of all, these, for the first time, armed drones, which essentially extend and double the range of the Javelin. So from about 1 or 2 miles out for the Javelin and up to 6 for the armed drones. That's significant. However, those drones were only provided, there are only about 100 of those. So I'd like to see many more of those going forward.
One thing that Ukraine has talked about, of course, is air defense. They want a no-fly zone. That's not going to happen, but the U.S. is providing more air defenses, including Stingers, which we've seen, again, Ukraine use so effectively like this. That is a helicopter being hit by a Stinger. Stingers can hit helicopters and even low-flying jets. And U.S. officials tell me they're trying to facilitate more advanced air defense systems, including systems that were originally created by the Soviet Union, known as SA-8s, and the more advanced S-300s. Why is that so important?
Well, this is the way to impose a no-fly zone, but imposing it from the ground as opposed to trying to control it from the air with NATO aircraft. And the Ukrainians have some systems now. You mentioned the Stinger. Yesterday's package announced by the president included hundreds of more Stinger missiles. That's great. But as you say, these are relatively short range. The good news is that among our 30 NATO allies, there are some allies who still have Soviet vintage equipment with which the Ukrainians are very familiar. So no training required. They know how to maintain these systems and so forth. So now the path forward is to get these Soviet vintage air defense systems from U.S. allies into the hands of the Ukrainians, and then backfill the Allied systems with more modern systems. So this is really a two-edge advantage for us. We get the right systems into the hands of the Ukrainians, and we up-arm our own allies.
And those systems should allow Ukraine to at least target, if not hit, Russian missiles and perhaps jets flying at a higher elevation. But we've seen another tactic, of course, in the last few days, last week or so, Russian troops moving around less, in part because of these American and NATO weapons, and using artillery more to unfortunately great effect. You can see the worst effects of that kind of artillery in Mariupol. It's scorched earth, clearly targeting civilian neighborhoods in an indiscriminate way. Now, the U.S. has sent some artillery rounds to Ukraine, but can the U.S. NATO weapons that they've provided to Ukraine really stop this Russian artillery?
The way to attack these Russian artillery systems, and I think what you see there in Mariupol, by the way, is just a prototype. It's an early example of the Russian campaign plan to besiege the larger Ukrainian cities, so Kyiv and Kharkiv in the east. But the way to attack this siege campaign is by way of attacking its supply lines. And here the systems that the U.S. is providing now to the Ukrainians, to include the additional systems announced yesterday, are effective ways to get at the supply lines. The supply lines run out of Belarus and out of Russia itself. They're long, they're vulnerable, they're not well guarded, they're largely road bound, and the Javelins and the Stingers are perfect systems to take the fight to those supply lines.
Zooming out, we were speaking to you earlier today, and you told us that these weapons, while exacting a higher cost on the Russians, will not be decisive. Explain that.
Now, I'm afraid we're actually headed towards a stalemate, with the Russians having a lot of firepower and the Ukrainians, enabled by us with the kind of systems that the president announced yesterday. But not these systems are not going to prove a decisive edge for our Ukrainian partners. At the end of the day, Nick, even in a prolonged stalemate, typically willpower on behalf of the Ukrainians will probably defeat, in my view, the firepower of the Russians. And that, I think, unfortunately, in this prolonged, brutal conflict that lays ahead, will be the equation.
And Doug, I've only got about 40 seconds left, so quickly, is there a risk of escalation, do you think, as the U.S., as NATO provides more weapons?
Of course. I mean, one of the tactics that we haven't seen the Russians use yet is to try to interdict NATO supply lines. And of course, those supply lines begin in NATO countries themselves along the western border with Ukraine. So if Russia were to try to assemble an interdiction campaign, that moves that campaign much closer to NATO borders. And that's one risk of escalation.
Doug Lute, appreciate it as always. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick.